Thanks. One aspect, and I want to apologise to the ambulance paramedics, because I meant to raise this last night in the context of the debate with the Taoiseach, in terms of the, there's many angles to that discussion, but one angle is about the relationship that the government takes to negotiating with trade unions or representative organisations. And one huge contrast that was really glaringly apparent, and this is directly related to the issue of social dialogue, right, is how the NASRA paramedics, in and around the same time that the then Taoiseach was sending back-channel packages to his mate in the NGAP, was refusing repeated requests from Deputies Breed Smith, Deputy Ruth Coppinger and others to engage with NASRA, the ambulance paramedics. And very explicitly at the time, the Taoiseach said, you can join whatever union you want, but you don't have to be recognised. The HSE doesn't have to recognise you. Refused the requests to instruct the HSE to engage with the ambulance paramedics, and said, and I quote, and this is relevant to the evidence that the Taoiseach gave yesterday, the government engages with the trade union movement through ICTU. That was the government policy. Now, I don't agree with that policy, because I think they should engage with the organisations that workers choose themselves to be represented by. But clearly the Taoiseach did not, the then Taoiseach did not abide by that policy, but operated a back channel to his mate in the NGAP, but wouldn't extend the same courtesy to the ambulance paramedics, who still are denied recognition by the HSE. Now, what do you think of that, in terms of double standards, and not being willing to recognise the chosen representatives of a particular group of workers, in this case, ambulance paramedics? And the second point I want to make to you, because on the 20th of October, I raised the issue of student nurses with you, and the failure to pay them, and the fact that the healthcare assistant pay that they were given in March and April, rightly, for the huge role they are playing in a very dangerous environment of COVID-19, you said in the Dáil that they should get the pay they got in March and April, and that you would, quote, follow through. Since then, nothing has happened. And Stephen Donnelly last night, when I asked him about it, about paying these student nurses, essentially made clear that's not the government's intention. These student nurses, who are in many cases holding together hospital wards and health workplaces in the context of COVID-19, where huge numbers of staff, employed staff, are out because of COVID-19, because of extraordinary high levels of infection with COVID-19 among nurses and among healthcare assistants. And yet we continue to exploit them when they are, in many cases, holding together workplaces that are on the front line of dealing with COVID-19. That is not acceptable. And I can tell you there's a lot of anger among student nurses about this, Taoiseach, and you should follow through on the commitment you made to me on the 20th of October and ensure that that exploitation of student nurses ends, and that they are given the respect and remuneration they deserve for the role they are playing in the fight against COVID-19.
Taoiseach. In terms of the issues raised by Deputy Boyd Barrett in terms of NASRA, I take your point. You will know yourself, because you said you don't agree with the ICTU position, but ICTU has a very strong view on this, in terms of new unions emerging, splits from unions, multiple unions creating difficulties in terms of efficiencies and effectiveness of negotiations and so on. Now, I have a bit of a conflict myself in this regard, because I was reared in a different environment. My late father would have broken ranks with the then ITGW and founded the National Busmen's Union. He was a founding member of the NBU in Cork, and was involved in many industrial activity, relations activity and strikes and so on. and so forth. So he would always be a strong defender of the actions he took at the time. But laterally in life, he also understood the need for balance and the need for some coherence in terms of the representation of workers in different sectors in relation to how one pursued one's rights in terms of pay, pension entitlements, and so on. So I do understand the point you were making. But again, in relation to that GMS contract and the GP contract, it is in many ways, because of the independent contractor status of GPs, it is one that has to be ultimately adopted by each individual GP in terms of whether or not they sign on for the offer, if you like, that is presented by the Health Services Executive in that regard. My own view is that if you have too much fragmentation in unions, that can be very negative too. And historically in Ireland, we had too much fragmentation, and that resulted in a lot of unnecessary industrial actions where unions were competing with each other to win membership. And in so doing, led to a lot of unnecessary industrial strife and undermined workers as well. I'm not talking about NASRA in that context now. I'm just talking more generally. And that's why ICTU's position has validity. And that's why I respect the ICTU's position on this, because ultimately, ICTU have resulted in very significant advances in society as well, through a whole range of its own activities and how it's pursued pay issues, pension issues, but also wider social justice issues.
Thank
and I think
you,
that has to be
Taoiseach.
acknowledged also in this debate.